This is Henry H. Neff, and this is the Earn and Invest podcast.
I've always wanted to be a writer. As a high schooler, I would write poetry and short stories. It was much the same in college. During medical school and residency, I had my first poetry published in medical journals. And eventually, as an attending physician out in the world, I wrote over 1,000 blog posts about doctoring. Writing for me was a hobby, not due to a lack of love or even willingness to work at it. I mainly I mainly had convinced myself years earlier that doctoring was a profession and writing was something I did in my minimal spare time, certainly not something I could do for money. As the years passed, I quickly grew tired of being a physician. Being a writer, on the other hand, still fills my dreams, even today. Henry Neff, a former history teacher, is the author and illustrator of 7 acclaimed fantasy novels for young readers and adults. His books include the 5-volume Tapestry series, the standalone novel Imperium, and his adult debut, The Witchstone. Henry Neff, welcome to Earn and Invest. Let's start at the beginning. When you decided to become a writer, you were a fairly accomplished corporate consultant with a lucrative job. Did you think you were going to switch over to writing and be able to make a living at it?
Good question. So no, I would say I didn't have any idea if this was going to be a successful switch. I didn't have any idea whether or not it was going to be sufficiently lucrative for me to be able to make a living at it. Really, it was prompted by kind of a dark night of the soul where I was enjoying my corporate life, but I didn't feel like it was scratching a deeper itch. And then when 9/11 happened, I had a really sort of deep misgiving about how I was spending my time and spending my life. And so when I made the switch, it wasn't really a strategically driven kind of career-minded pursuit or sort of thought process. It was much more of a, gosh, if I get to the end of my life and if I haven't done these things, well, I've lived a worthwhile life given the skills and talents and interests that I happen to have. And so it wasn't really, so when I made the switch to teaching, it was after a conversation with my brother where I was sort of howling at the moon about, gosh, am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? And he pointed out quite correctly that I had made my career decisions or my job, my sort of professional decisions thus far based on the money and the prestige. And how would I spend my time if I had all the money in the world? And I sort of surprised myself. My answer was so fast. I didn't really know how this had been percolating in the back of my brain. I said, oh, I'd write and illustrate children's books and I teach high school. And he said, well, okay, maybe you should do that. And so when I made the switch, I was fortunate enough to be able to start teaching the following school year at a private high school in San Francisco. And then that very first year, that very first kind of winter holiday break, I started writing what was going to be the first book in the Tapestry. And so it was much more of feeling my way through the process as opposed to laying out a concrete series of steps with a real plan in mind. I had to kind of rediscover the artistic and creative side of myself. But it was this fantastic moment where when I started doing it, even though I was kind of flailing around, it just felt right. It felt like a puzzle piece kind of locking into place.
I want to get to that beginning period when you left corporate America, when you left consulting and started writing and being a teacher. But before I get there, you shared with me in a previous conversation an episode you had at a high school reunion. And all disclosure, Henry and I went to the same high school, although we weren't friends in high school. And you mentioned that you had showed up maybe a little bit cocky, feeling confident in your job choice and the wealth you were accruing and what was going on. And a conversation changed your trajectory. Do you mind sharing that conversation?
Sure. No, I mean, and I wouldn't say that I was accruing wealth as a as a young business analyst, but it was definitely on a path to doing well in life financially. But yeah, I mean, so when we graduated, so we went to a huge high school, right? A gigantic high school. Um, so big, in fact, that I had to go to both graduate. We had to have two graduation ceremonies, and I had to go to both of them. And when I was sitting there, I was right there in front and I was watching people get their diplomas. And not only were there people whose names I didn't know, there were people I'd literally never seen before, right? And so reunions, especially pre-social media days, were always really interesting for me because you would run into old friends, but you would also run into people. And one of my sort of the things I really enjoyed about reunions was talking to people I really didn't know very well in high school, right? And but we went to I don't remember, I guess it was our 5-year reunion. And in the mid 90s, going to work in, it's funny when you look back, going to work in management consulting and going to work at McKinsey, which was the firm that I joined, that was kind of considered very much in the zeitgeist at that time. And like Chelsea Clinton went to go work for McKinsey. It was a lot of Pete Buttigieg, actually. He worked in the same office that I did, albeit well after I was there. But it was a big brand name, and it was pre-scandals that have since tainted McKinsey's name. And so I was pretty puffed up with myself that I worked there, and I definitely did name drop it a lot as a brand at that time in my life. I thought it was really important. And so when we went to the reunion, I ran into a guy that I had played a lot of sports with growing up, and I was friends with, but I wasn't super tight with. But I ran into him, and he was he was in his cups, and pretty tipsy, and he saw me and he stopped and he said, Neff, what's going on? How are you? What are you up to? And I told him what I was doing, and I thought that it would really impress him because I was really impressed with it. And his reaction was anything but. He looked like I just told him terrible news. He almost recoiled, and he was like, and he dropped an F-bomb. And then he was like, I can't believe that. I thought you were going to be like an artist and doing something really creative. And if people knew me when I was growing up, I was always the kid that drew a lot. And my parents were both art historians, and I grew up in kind of a academic artsy household. And taking this corporate path, um, I don't regret it. But his comment really did make me do a little bit of reflecting of, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? What is my purpose in doing this? And that I didn't leave then, but fast forward a little bit when 9/11 happened, and that did come back to me when I was thinking about making that switch and getting back to the things that really motivated me. So I wouldn't say that conversation triggered the change, but it was definitely a seed that contributed to the change and helped me reflect a little bit on what is actually important to me. And when I really thought about it, it wasn't, I didn't care about the work that I was really doing in consulting. It didn't sort of fill me up in that way. And I also realized that I'm not a terribly money motivated person. So the idea of sacrificing my time on this earth to try to accrue wealth, that actually wasn't important to me. If the wealth comes as a byproduct of things that are more meaningful to me, that's great. I have nothing against money, but I didn't want that to be my sole purpose for how I was spending my time.
So there's obviously these confluence of factors, right? You have these two conversations, 9/11 happens. So you decide to become a history teacher and a writer. Were you as passionate about becoming a history teacher as you were about writing? Or was it more like, I can do the history teacher to make money and then I can pursue this thing I'm really passionate about and not have to worry about whether it's successful or not?
No, I love teaching. Teaching still fires me up. And I had a really great arrangement with the school. I taught at a high school called Stewart Hall High School in San Francisco, and it's part of the Schools of the Sacred Heart Network. And they were phenomenal. And when I got a publishing deal with that book that I started writing that first winter holiday break, they were incredibly supportive. They embraced it. Um, and the school was on a block schedule, so they could be accommodating for me to allow me the indulgence of doing the writing and teaching because I only had to come in 3 days a week, which was fantastic. But they were incredibly supportive. I loved teaching. And I am one of those people who really does believe that you can show me a lot of teaching certificates. I really do believe that teachers are born, not made. I think you can hone your talents as a teacher. I think some people are just natural teachers and some people are not. And I think I am a natural teacher, and I enjoyed it tremendously. I am still in touch with a lot of my students, but also, I mean, talking about a confluence, teaching history also sort of informed and aided my writing process. The books that I write, they are labeled fantasy novels because they have things like magic in them, but like the Tapestry series and Imperium later, which is a standalone, those incorporate a lot of history, real history woven into them. So I'll find ways to incorporate things like the Spanish Armada or Charlemagne or American history or other things and weave them into the storyline, the characters, the history, the plot in ways hopefully that ground the fantasy in things that are more I guess real and tangible to readers and give it the story a little bit more heft than it might have otherwise. So really I saw them as complementary pursuits.
One way that I knew that my career transition was right and appropriate and felt good is when I left being a doctor and started being more of a podcaster, public speaker, and writer. I didn't miss the doctor identity, which I thought I would. Did you miss the corporate consultant identity? Was there ever a moment where you're like, I used to be this thing and I'm not anymore?
I wouldn't say I missed the identity as a consultant, in the sense that I never got the sense that I was going to do that forever when I was there. So when I joined McKinsey, I didn't even know really what it was. And I had been intending to go to law school out of college. And somebody suggested that I interview there. They thought that it would be a good fit. I did, and I learned more about them during the process. And so the idea of working on interesting big problems and then being able to shift gears and do something else and work on a different problem and having that time, if you wanted to stay in sort of a corporate path, almost count like dog years, right? So if you spend 5 years at McKinsey, typically you're going into a pretty senior position at a company if you want to go in-house or do something like that. Or if I wanted to become a lawyer, I would probably have been able to go to whatever law school I wanted to go to, and they would have paid for it. So there were a lot of perks to that job. I never saw myself doing that forever. I do miss sometimes the ability to wrestle with a discrete problem that is sort of self-contained, try to come to an answer and tie a bow on it and be done. Right. So doing a consulting engagement is typically a product, depending on the engagement, typically kind of 3 to 6 months. Some are shorter, some are longer. And then you kind of, dust your hands off and you pull the ripcord and you're finished with it. And you don't have to worry about the pesky implementation of your big ideas. But writing a novel can take years. And it is a much squashier, more nebulous, process. And so there are times I do miss having that sort of discrete, okay, like how do we help them increase market share? How do we help them have a commercialization strategy for this interesting new kind of proprietary technology they've developed? Those to me, I sometimes miss that aspect of it. And I do miss the collegial aspect of it. I worked with some incredible people, Rhodes Scholars, Marshall Scholars, really, really brilliant people. I was consistently the dumb guy in the room. And the other thing though that was nice about McKinsey, or at least the Chicago office when I was there, they were nice people. So sometimes, I have a lot of friends who went into banking and stuff like that, and there can be a culture that rewards bad behavior. At least when I was in consulting, we didn't really have that culture. People, you kind of had to be a good person to work with, as in addition to being hardworking and being bright and adding value and all that stuff. So I miss some of those things. Writing is very solitary.
You mentioned book writing is somewhat nebulous, and earlier you almost flippantly said, well, when I was teaching and I got my first book deal. This is a culture and a profession that I think a lot of people don't understand. So, for those of us who have dreamed about being authors or writers, but have no clue how you actually do that, tell me the mechanics of getting your first book deal, especially when you at that point didn't have a name, right? You probably didn't have a name, you
Sure.
didn't have a brand, you're a history teacher, you used to be a consultant. How did you go about getting a book deal?
So my process was unusual even back then. It would be incredibly unusual now because the industry has changed. So there was a term back in the day called the slush pile. And the slush pile was you could send your manuscript if you were an unpublished, unagented writer. You could send your manuscript into a publisher where it would go into like, I always think of like the closing scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark where they're like taking the ark back into the warehouse, right? So your manuscript would go into this giant warehouse of manuscripts. And some 21-year-old editorial assistant right out of college, it was their job, almost like a script reader, right, in Hollywood, to go through the slush pile and try to see, is there anything interesting here? So I sent my manuscript. So the original rough draft of The Hound of Rowan, which is the first book in the Tapestry series, I think the first manuscript for that was, I think, around like 150,000 words,
Wow.
which is like a 600 page novel or thereabouts. And this is for a middle grade novel, right? So for 8 to 12. So it was a monster, an unwieldy monster of a manuscript. And so Harry Potter was all the rage then. This is back in like 2000, you know, two, three, right around there, 2004 maybe. And so I was like, all right, well, Scholastic publishes Harry Potter, and those books are gigantic. So at least I know they're willing to publish a big middle grade book. So I sent it to Scholastic, right? And
A Hail Mary.
a Hail Mary. And I got an email from a gentleman named David Levithan, who is an editor at Scholastic and is also actually a very well-known children's author who is sort of a pioneer in writing LGBTQ content for YA readers, right? So he's both a well-known author and an editor. I didn't know that at the time. I was wholly ignorant about the industry. But I got an email, this is so long ago, to my Yahoo email address from David saying, "Hey, I'm David Levithan. I'm an editor at Scholastic, and we got your manuscript for your book, The Hound of Rowan, and I want to let you know that the early readers have really liked it. So it's going to be making the rounds here, and I just want to give you a heads up that that is the case." So I then proceeded to hit refresh on my email every 10 seconds for about 2 months, right? Just constantly waiting to get more news. And so I did get more news, and it wasn't exactly what I wanted, but it turned out to be great. So he got back to me probably about 6, 8 weeks later, and he said, Henry, it's David again. We are going to take a pass on the book. So it involves a magic academy and magical school. Obviously, Harry Potter is our bell cow. So it sort of sits in the same category there. So we're going to take a pass on this, but one of the people who really loved it just left Scholastic and went to Random House. Here's his name. Why don't you give him a shout? And I did. And this person's name was Nick Eliopoulos. And it happened to be really serendipitous. So Nick was a young, really talented editor. He had just arrived at Random House, and he really did love the book. And he was looking for something to pitch at an acquisition meeting. And that's what happened. So for people who aren't familiar, if an editor likes your book, that's not enough. They have to go pitch the book internally at what's called an acquisitions meeting. And at that meeting, it's not just the editor and some potentially other editors, the editor that they report to. There are also people from marketing, from finance, from PR, right? It sort of takes a village to truly acquire a book. But Nick pitched it. He pitched it as a trilogy. He and I conferred, and I helped him. This was actually something where my background at McKinsey was helpful. I helped him craft the pitch. So I helped him. We put together kind of the one pager of here's what this is. Here's the vision for how this story is going to unfold. Here is kind of the one paragraph and the elevator pitch for books 2 and book 3, so that they could see that this wasn't sort of a standalone idea, and that there were some real legs to this. And so, that's what happened. And so they made an offer. All the agents that didn't want to talk to me before, all of a sudden did want to talk to me, right? And there is a funny catch-22 for people who want to get into writing. If you want to go a traditional publishing route, there are lots of routes these days if you don't want to go that route. But if you do want to go a traditional publishing route, these days you almost have to have an agent. It's not a hard and fast rule, but most published authors with traditional houses do have an agent. Most traditional publishing houses will not read manuscripts if you do not have an agent. And there's this funny catch-22 where it's hard to get an agent if you haven't been published, and it's hard to get published if you don't have an agent. So there is this sort of funny dynamic you have to navigate as a new writer these days. But that's my story. It is an antiquated story. There is a tremendous amount of luck involved. And so one of the things I always say to young, not necessarily young, but aspiring published authors is there's a lot of luck involved. You can write a fantastic manuscript. You can have all the talent in the world, and your manuscript might be hitting the market at a time when whatever you've written about is just not in vogue. The editor who sees it might love it, but they just signed something up last 6 months ago that is sort of in the same slot in their taxonomy of what's coming to market, right? There's a lot of luck involved. I absolutely believe, however, if you have talent and you have perseverance, so you have to stick with it, you will get published one day, but you have to have both. So I got very lucky right off the bat. I have tremendous amount of respect for people who have not gotten lucky right off the bat, but stick with it. But you do have to have, there is a threshold, though, of talent that you have to meet, I would say.
So many things come out of what you were just talking about in my own experience. One is that having a true fan, right? So getting someone on your side, building the relationship with someone who is within the field is so big. The other is that collaborative aspect. Once an acquiring editor likes your manuscript, that doesn't mean, as you said, that it was going to get published, you're going to get an offer. But being able to then collaborate with that acquiring editor to help them fashion the pitch, which is something I actually did with my current book, The Purpose Code, was amazingly helpful. And last but not least, there is nothing more painful than getting a response from acquiring editor saying, I loved your book, but unfortunately, the marketing people had some issues with
Sure.
your platform, or we just had another book like this, and so we don't want to compete with ourselves. There is nothing more heartbreaking than that.
It is a rejections-based business, and you have to develop a thick skin. Every once in a while, you'll read some story in Publishers Weekly or some announcement that somebody, their book, 10 different publishing houses bid on their book at auction and it sold for 7 figures. And that is very, very, very rare. And one of the things you quickly learn in this business, if you want to do it as a business, as a living, is that, getting that publishing deal, that is only one little step on sort of building a career. And to really make a living as a working author, there's a lot more that goes into it. It is a very, very easy profession to romanticize, particularly also if you write for children, because people tend to romanticize children's books. I was actually just last night, though, reading a interesting book called The Stories Behind the Stories, which takes a lot of famous children's books and it kind of gives you these 2 to 3 page stories behind how this book came to market, things you didn't know about how it was developed. And I mean, if there is a common thread in this book, and these are all the classic children's book stories, almost all of these books were rejected and did not find a publisher initially. I'm a big Dune geek in science fiction. I think very famously, Frank Herbert was rejected by 36 or 37 different publishers before it found a home. It is now the best-selling, science fiction series of all time. So if you're gonna take your ball and go home, the first time you get a rejection letter, you will never make it, right? You will never ever make it. Got to be
We are,
tough.
go ahead, say that again.
No, you got to be tough.
We are talking to Henry Neff, a former history teacher. He's the author and illustrator of several acclaimed fantasy novels. And we are talking about the passion as well as the business of being an author. We're going to take a short break. I'm Doc G, and this is the Earn and Invest podcast. All right, this is the break that we put some ads in. Any questions, problems, issues before we get going again?
One quick, are my answers fitting like the length you want?
Don't
Okay,
worry
because I
about it.
just want to be
Just
mindful of.
Yeah,
Okay,
don't worry about it. Speak to your heart, tell your stories. There's so much good stuff here. I wouldn't want to stop you and slow you down.
okay, great,
All right, let's get back live then. We're going to talk more about the business after this.
sure.
Um, we'll go back live on 3, 2, 1. We are back with author Henry Neff. His books include a five-volume his books include the five-volume Tapestry series, the standalone novel Imperium, and his adult debut, The Witchstone, which I just read and loved. Henry, we've been talking about the passion of becoming an author. Certainly, you have to deal with failure. Even the most acclaimed authors do. Let's get down to the business a little bit. First and foremost, how do authors get paid?
Great question. So authors, if you are, and now I should couch this. I am talking about authors who are going and getting published through a traditional publishing house. So I'm not talking about self-publishing, which has its totally different dynamics. I'm also not talking about people who are doing stuff through book packagers and other things. So I'm just talking about traditional. I went out, I pitched publishing house, they acquired my manuscript, and now it's coming to market. So the ways you can typically get paid, when a publisher acquires your book, they pay you what's called an advance. And that is an advance against royalty. So they're giving you some money up front, right? And then that money, if you have a decent agent, that money is always yours to keep. So even if the book never sells a copy, as long as you've done your job and delivered a manuscript and all that stuff, you keep the advance. That is your money. Then you have in a contract what are called royalty rates. And royalty rates and they vary based on hardcover or paperback. Sometimes there are specific rates if Walmart or Target is selling the book. Sometimes there's a different rate for mass marketers and things like that. But that is the percentage of the list price that you get off every book that is sold. So let's say if you have in your contract, you have a 10% royalty rate on hardcover, and your book is the list price. So it doesn't matter what the retailer sells it for. The list price on the book is $25. You are getting $2.50 off every book that's sold. That gets applied against the advance. That gets deducted from the advance that they have paid you, right? You do not earn any of those royalties until you have earned out your advance. So when they say a book is earned out, that means that it has earned enough money for the author to actually be collecting royalties above and beyond, right, the advance that they were paid.
Which
And
doesn't happen that often, right? I mean,
it does not happen
most books
nearly as
do
often
not
as
earn out their advance.
most books, I believe, don't earn out their advance. Most books never sell 1,000 copies, right? So the average person, if you told them, and it is kind of shocking when you look at how much work goes into making a book, not just by the person who wrote the book, but by editors, by art directors, by copy editors, right? By the marketing and publicity people within the publisher. There's a lot of work that goes into making a book. And to think that that has all gone into making a product that more likely than not will not earn out is kind of amazing. But really the business model for a publisher, and it's good if you're an author to think about this because it helps you, it informs your perspective on your own business. They really have kind of a venture capitalist model, right? Where they are making lots of smaller bets, right? And the ones that pay off have to pay for all the other ones and then some. But most of the bets they make are not going to pay off, right? But so you earn royalties. That is the basic thing. You also have subsidiary rights as an author for anything that you've written. So let's say there's an audiobook. Let's say that somebody in France wants to translate your book and publish your book. All of those things are additional revenue streams, right, that can come in. So for the Tapestry, I was really fortunate in some ways. Random House had global rights to that book, which meant that they also could serve as the agent for that book with foreign publishers and sell the rights to foreign publishers. Most agents don't want to let publishers have those rights. They want to keep those rights. But I was new, they really wanted them, and that's what happened. They did a great job of selling those rights into other territories. So I think they sold into 19 or 20 different territories around the world. The Hound of Rowan earned out before one copy ever came off a printing press. So you can earn out your advance that way too. So I was earning royalties for that right away. Imperium, my standalone novel, sold for a lot of money to HarperCollins, right? They ponied up a lot of money for that. It's a double-edged sword getting a big advance from a publisher. So in the one sense, you're getting a bunch of money, and that's nice. They're invested in the book, so you can be reasonably confident that they're going to market and promote the book. But it also puts tremendous pressure on that book to earn out. Imperium didn't turn out. So Imperium got a ton of critical acclaim. It was Entertainment Weekly's middle grade book of the year. It got starred reviews. It was on the Texas Lone Star list, which is a big thing where, it gets, school kids in Texas are supposed to read this book. Got all the critical acclaim you could want. It didn't sell well, right? And so that book never earned out. I don't know if it will ever earn out. And as an author, that is a black mark against your name. And that's absolutely going to impact your next book deal. So it is sort of a tricky thing to navigate. You are in some ways, until you're really a household name, you are in some ways kind of only as good as your last book. So there is a lot of anxiety as a business, as a working writer, which is why I tell a lot of people never quit your day job, right? Find ways to work around so you don't have the financial pressure on you to, gosh, this book has to make it or I'm done, right? That puts a lot of pressure on you, uh, emotionally, spiritually. It also, I think, impacts creative decisions. So you might be compromising your creative vision because you feel like you have to write something more commercial. I don't know if that ever works. So lots of things to think about.
I've seen a number similar to your average working author makes about $10,000 a year doing it, which means that there are lots of other models out there for making money and being an author. One is the passion play, right? You do it on the side while you do something else, like be a teacher or what have you. The other is, especially in the nonfiction world, if you have another business and the book becomes a funnel to that business. So a lot of people write books about money or coaching or these kind of things, and that becomes a funnel to bring people in as coaching clients or to buy their courses or to buy some type of product or service. But as a standalone job, it's a very small number of people who
Tiny.
can make it in the book industry. You've mentioned agents a few times,
Mhm.
and the world of book publishing is so varied, especially if you're not going with a big five publisher. There are definitely independent publishers out there who don't require agents. Tell
Yep.
me about the calculus of getting an agent. And I know for a lot of people, getting an agent is feels to them like actually getting a book published because it's just so hard to get an agent in the first
It can
place.
be harder. I mean, I would love to know if anybody's done sort of a study of what percentage of submissions to publishers are accepted and what percentage of applications to agents are accepted. The number for the agents might be lower. It is incredibly challenging. So an agent, for people, if they're not familiar, because it can vary a little bit from industry to industry. I remember, like when Entourage was on TV on HBO, you always thought of like Ari as being the, like that's an agent, right? That is not an agent in the literary world. So a literary agent, and there is a spectrum of things that they can do and a number of different hats they can wear. Every agent is a little bit different. But if you distill it down to its most essential function, an agent is somebody who sells your work, negotiates the contract, and ensures after the contract is signed that the terms of the contract are upheld and that you are paid when you should be paid. That is their core function. Some agents are also editorial and like to work with their authors on developing the next project. They read many, many drafts. They give feedback. They help shape the manuscript. They might be a thought partner in developing new ideas for projects. Some agents really help authors craft a vision for their career, right? A longer, so here's our goal for the short term, medium term, long term, etc. Um, it really can vary based on the interests of the agent and their expertise and their skill sets. Many agents are former editors at publishing houses who realized they could make a lot more money as an agent than working in-house at a publisher. And they've also been on the other side of the negotiations, so that helps them as well. So that is what an agent does. Agents, at the end of the day, agents are besieged with submissions. So when anybody asks me about how to submit to an agent, uh, I do think a lot of times the negative statistics associated with this industry are inflated by just sort of nonsensical submissions. So you sent your fairy tale to a cookbook publisher, right? You just spammed the market basically, as opposed to having a more and that's just an automatic rejection, and that counts as a rejection, right? But that's a rejection that could have easily been avoided. The same thing I think also happens with agents. So I think sometimes people don't do their homework on agents. The best thing I think you can do is really research the agent landscape, find an agent who is looking for work like yours or who represents work like yours, right? Reach out to them and give them, follow their submission guidelines to the letter. A lot of people think they're being creative when they do their own thing. No, don't be creative with submissions. Just follow their instructions and articulate to them why you are reaching out to them individually, right? What is it about them? Because if they feel like you're just spamming the marketplace, every other agent has this manuscript in their inbox, they're not going to be nearly as interested, right? So just by doing a little bit of homework and tailoring your message, I do think you can swing the odds significantly more in your favor. And then the key is also you have to get their interest quickly, right? So I would love to know an honest answer from them, but I would imagine that most agents probably don't read more than 5 to 10 pages of a submission, if that, before making a very quick determination of whether or not the season even has a chance.
Yeah, you better have a good hook. Like
You need one.
if you ever doubted,
Yeah,
you've got it's just like in an email. You've got the first few sentences to get someone interested in that manuscript. If that beginning introduction or whatever you're submitting to them isn't pretty darn strong, you're gonna
sure.
lose them. Yeah.
And there's just no question. So I'm a member of the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. And years ago, they asked me to be a judge for their award for a middle grade novel. And what that meant was I got probably 400 or 500 middle grade books shipped to me by different publishers, right? And there were two other judges on this for this award. So we divided up the 500 among, into three. But then I don't have time to read 165, 170 middle grade novels and also do what I'm doing. So what I did, and I would imagine it's very similar to what editors and agents do, I would read the first 5 to 10 pages. And if after 5 to 10 pages, I was like, okay, story's got off to a good start. I have a lot of confidence in this ability, this person's writing skill and ability and everything else. I would put it in a pile that said, okay, I'm gonna read the rest of this. If it didn't meet a really high bar early on, because I know this is for an award, this is gonna have to blow everybody's socks off, right? If it didn't meet that bar, I just put it aside after 5 to 10 pages, and these were published books, right? So no disrespect to the author, but it's just, that's not, it might be a good book. That's not going to be an award-winning book. And I think agents and editors do the same thing. And you also have to be mindful of the fact that attention spans, all of our attention spans are shrinking all the time. And that's also true of the reading public. So your beautiful, slow burn of a novel, it might be an incredible novel. It is absolutely going to be a tougher sell, right? Doesn't mean it's not going to get published, but it will be a harder sell.
I also want to throw out there something, at least from my experience, is the warm introduction is really important. So if you're into something, for instance, I happen to be into writing and I happen to be into finance. So I started a podcast about personal finance, which meant that I was interviewing people constantly about personal finance. Some of these people had written big books, some of them had famous agents, et cetera, et cetera. So I built a community around myself of these people
Mhm.
doing this thing, which meant that I had people who actually believed in me. So they said, oh, you would really like this agent, and they're into what we like to write.
Sure.
And so that warm introduction of having someone who works with that agent or works with that publisher writing an email and saying, hey, I want to introduce you to my friend so and so who's a writer and really has put out some incredible stuff. And
Yep.
they happen to have a manuscript available. I found that to be
You
incredibly
just you
helpful.
just you just hit the key point. I was just going to say I want to add a little color to this because I agree with you 100%, right? And I think these days, publishing has probably changed more in the last 20 years than it had changed in the previous 400 years, right? And it is still evolving at an unbelievable speed. And so the idea of just being able to hole up and write your book and put your book out into the world and not have to do any promotion or marketing or building of community or all those things, that's getting harder and harder and harder to do. And these days, I think many publishers want to look at authors as a complete package above and beyond just the content of their pages, right? But to your point, when you're building community and you're building relationships and you're doing complementary activities and kind of creating an ecosystem, right, that is favorable to your book, all of those things, I mean, gosh, the former consultant, the synergies, right, of that are real. They are real, right? And synergy is a buzzword and all that stuff, but it is a real thing. But you hit it on an important thing. So, the more connections you make, the more introductions happen, the more, connections and that sort of whole network effect that is starting to happen. And you never know where it can lead you, right? I mean, you just truly never know. The craziest things can happen. Um, but the kernel, and a lot of people forget this, you got to do the work, right? And so I get a lot of emails from people who are, I'm thinking, hey, Henry, I like your books, right? I've really enjoyed your books. I am thinking about writing a book. Would you introduce me to your agent, to your publisher? And it's like, well, I think it's awesome that you were thinking it. First off, thank you for reading my books. Secondly, I think it's great that you were thinking about writing a book. And I don't want to stomp on that, right? I don't want to belittle that. That's where it starts, but that can't be where it ends, right? And thinking about writing a book is not starting a book. And it's certainly not finishing a book or revising a manuscript and getting things ready so that you have a credible piece of work that you can hand across to somebody and say, here you go. I want you to take a look at this, right? Nobody's interested in your half-baked idea. Everybody's got ideas and everybody's thought about writing a book, right? So it's kind of like being like, yeah, I'm thinking about running an Ironman. It's like, cool. Let me know when you've run a 10K. There's a big difference between some of these things. And so the fact that you have done the work, that you have a manuscript that you can hand off to somebody. So at that point, all you need is a break. And the likelihood of getting a break is so much better if you built that network, but then you have to be in a position to capitalize on it by having done the work, and you have done the work, right?
And
So
I'd add,
that's where it really all comes together.
and I'd add the caveat for the nonfiction world. In the nonfiction world, you don't necessarily have a huge percentage of the book or even much of the book written when you pitch it, but you have the expertise. Hopefully, you have a
Right.
platform. You have your hundreds of thousands of followers in different places, which even in any world nowadays, the first thing they're going to ask you is, well, what kind of platform do you have?
Yeah,
So,
you've done
but
your
in the
10,000
nonfiction,
hours. Yeah.
yeah, in your
Yeah.
nonfiction world, you don't write the whole book, but you do have to write a pretty intense uh, book proposal if you really want to be taken
Yes.
seriously. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and that is a good caveat because I had a friend who asked me for advice on doing a proposal, and they had a nonfiction book proposal. And when I looked at it, I was like, oh, this is a different animal. I make stuff up and I write it down, right? And then I tried, and I hope it's exciting enough that people want to continue and turn the page. A nonfiction thing is a different animal. You do have to come to it with either a tremendous amount of credibility and expertise, uh, and these days I think it's also and a community that you have built up, right? So I think one of the first things that publishers are going to look at, actually there's another parent in town where I live she is, I don't know if she's the head of PR, she's one of the very senior PR people at Simon and Schuster, and she does all the big political books and historical books, all the David McCullough books and Doris Kearns Goodwin and all that stuff, and also a lot of politician books. Um, I think when she is looking at a nonfiction book proposal, one of the first things they're going to look at is, you know, where have you spoken? What is your profession? What is your job title? And what kind of community follows you? Right? That is going to be a big deal.
So, Henry, it sounds like a daunting task. There are a lot of people here who have the inkling, maybe the drive and the passion to write a book, but they're ensconced in their other careers and they're saying, well, how do I begin? I'm sure you get a million of these emails, right? People say, I love your, exactly that. I love your book. Hey, I was thinking about doing this.
Mhm.
What's kind of the baseline advice you give to someone who's at the beginning of this trajectory?
Make a little progress each day. It doesn't have to be a lot. It can literally just be baby steps, but push it forward each day, just even a little bit, right? Even if it's just jotting down an idea in a journal, right? Even if it is just, so I also illustrate my books, so, and I'm a pretty visual thinker. So sometimes if I'm hitting a little obstacle, I will draw, right? And sometimes that triggers different kinds of ideas. And it's almost like using different muscles, but pushing it forward a little bit each day. So whether that is, I'm going to get up 20 minutes earlier than I normally do, and I'm going to use those 20 minutes to sit down and just do some writing and put it down. And getting up early, I have found is, at least for me, and I think a lot of other people, very, very helpful because I tend to be too careful when I'm drafting something new. And the universal advice on when you're working on a rough draft is just tell it to yourself. Tell the story to yourself. It's gonna suck. It's gonna be a mess and have all kinds of things that need to be fixed, but don't kind of shut your inner critic up and just get it down, right? Even if it's a mess, because it's much easier to respond to and chisel and sculpt a mess than to be trying to sculpt something perfectly in your mind, right? In your mind's eye before you ever start slapping stuff together. So just get it down, make a little bit of progress each day. I also think a big one is understand and recognize before the fact that you are going to hit a point, probably many times, where you want to abandon it. Don't. There are lots of people that start books. There are very few people that finish them. You want to train yourself to be the person who finishes the draft. That is a discipline. That's not a talent. That's a discipline that leads to, right, the talent. And don't just even if you don't think it's going to go anywhere, even if you think it's finish it. Just finish it and fix it later, but finish it. There are many people who get frustrated, throw up their hands, and they walk away. And that's a shame because they might have been working on something that one day would have been great, right? And checked all their boxes. So little progress, right? Try to get up a little bit early, especially if you have a busy schedule. That's a great time to find a little extra time. Doesn't have to be a lot. And acquire the discipline of finishing what you start.
Well, Henry, I wanted to thank you for coming on the show today. As I think about our conversation, what I really come down to is this idea that, you know, being a writer is a lousy way to make a living, but it's probably a wonderful way to make a life. And so it might not be what pays your bills, but if you are interested enough and have the drive and are willing to be persistent, you will most likely find a way to succeed. I want to end this episode the way I end every episode by asking you what's up next with your life and where people can reach out to you. First and foremost, tell us about The Witchstone. I just read it myself, a fantastic novel. Where can people get it and what is it about?
So, well, thank you again for reading it. So it's right here over my shoulder. So The Witchstone, it is an adult contemporary urban fantasy. I think that's what they're calling these things these days. And it is, at its heart, it is about a curse. And it is about the demon who manages the curse on Hell's behalf and the family that has been under this curse going back to colonial days. And the demon and one of the members of the family having to go on a quest to supposedly break the curse. But the demon has ulterior motives of his own and his own situation that he's trying to wrestle with. It is funny, it is fast paced, but hopefully, and I hope you had this reaction to it, while I wanted it to be funny and I wanted it to be brisk, I also wanted you to end up caring about the characters and for it to have some moments that have real pathos and real, maybe even get a tear or two at certain points in the book. That's something I always try to do. I want readers to always feel to me, I always feel the special magic of reading when I'm experiencing a pretty broad range of emotions. And so I always try to create that for readers. But it is essentially they have to set out to try to break this curse. They have 6 days. There's a ticking clock in this story. The demon has his own agenda. The young woman is trying to save her family. But as we find out, the curse has a lot more to it than we might initially think.
Well, Henry, I wanted to thank you so much for coming on Earn and Invest today. I guess one of the things I really enjoyed about the book is I found myself rooting for both the protagonist and the antagonist at different times of the reading. Thanks so much for spending this time with us today.
Well, I really enjoyed it. And, purpose and passion are big themes of my life. And I embrace the opportunity to talk about it. And I want to tip my cap to you for following your heart and where your career has led you, and congratulate you on all the success and the upcoming publication of your book.
That's a wrap. Excellent. I leave things running just for a few minutes to catch anything we talk about after the show. Um, yeah, it was such a black box to me when I decided, okay, I'm really going to pursue book writing as opposed to having writing be a hobby, etc. Um, and I think a lot of people stumble on that. They don't know how. And the truth of the matter is they probably don't know how hard it actually truly is to write a solid book.
Right.
How big of a process that is. Because I think a lot of us, like after I wrote my first book, got real good editing, really
Mhm.
went through the whole process. I'm like, okay, I had no idea what I was doing before this.
Oh, sure. I mean, that's part of I should have mentioned this in the thing, is also if this is something that is important to you, is being kind to yourself
Yeah.
and having a sense that this is you're playing the long game. So, sometimes I look back at my first book I wrote, and there's certain things I'm like, oh, I do this differently and this differently and this differently. And I always try to, whenever I start going down that road, I say, stop. That was the best book that you could write then. It's not, you can write a better book now. And thank goodness. And one of the nice things actually about writing is that, you don't lose anything off your fastball as you move on. So it's not like being like a physicist. All the physicists make their great discoveries by the age of 30 or whatever. Or it's not like being an athlete. So a writer, I hope the next book I write is better than anything I've written before, and going on and being kind to yourself and playing the long game. I will point out though that, when you jumped into writing the book, as you mentioned earlier, you'd written over 1,000 blog posts.
Oh yeah. I mean, I've been writing my whole life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you weren't starting a marathon
No,
having done
yeah.
no running or no training beforehand, right? You had developed a lot of those muscles.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting topic is how different writing a book is than writing a blog post. I would write, 1,000-word blog post, which means they had to be
Yeah.
incredibly concise, pack an idea, really have a nice, quick arc. And it is interesting. That's a whole different story about how complicated that transition is. Um, One thing that I found, and again, I speak more for nonfiction than fiction, is
Mhm.
I've found that even if you don't find success with Big Five publishing, there's so many different ways now to get into the publishing world. So I got an agent again through a warm contact, and I had a little bit of a platform and a brand. My first book, Taking Stock, got over 30 something rejections, and I had some of those really close ones, right? Like a number of the big five, we got stuff from the acquiring editors going,
Um,
I really loved it, but I just, and so we got those kind of heartfelt letters back, and I ended up going with a small press. Um, and then for my second book, believe it or not, I had a warm introduction to an editor, and so I kind of went in unagented, but eventually brought my agent in, but kind of started the process without them. Um, and ended up working really close with the acquiring editor to sell it to his whole team, which is kind of
yeah,
what you were talking
yeah,
about,
yeah.
which was wonderful because that was like, okay, all of a sudden I got this guy on my team. And Harriman House, the press that bought it, ended up being bought by Macmillan
Mhm.
shortly thereafter. So I became a Big Five author somewhat by accident.
Well, but
Um,
but but it's great that they kept it. So one of the things you hear about also are these
yeah,
horror stories of, books being orphaned, which means like the
yeah,
editor bought
which
it,
is heartbreaking too. Yeah,
which is common.
heartbreaking.
And
Yeah,
then also consolidation of mergers, and all of a sudden people come in and they say, you we're looking at the portfolio of stuff coming down the pike, and we we're going to just drop all that stuff. And you keep your advance, which is great, but now your book isn't coming out and you have to start over. So that's great that they kept it. It's yeah, I mean there are no things are getting more flexible all the time. I'm trying to think if this was before or after we spoke. But I talked to my agent. We were just catching up on stuff. And I was asking her about trends in the market. And she said one of the big things that was going on right now is all of these people who are building up big audiences on Kindle, unlimited. So they're
Yeah.
basically self-publishing and
And
going on
yeah.
Kindle Unlimited, building an audience, and then leveraging that into a big publishing deal
Yeah.
with, and it's almost like, I mean, it's fascinating, in this talk about getting the old McKinsey brain, like how these people are building a new model to it. I do think that the power of the traditional publishers is only going to go down
Hmm.
with time.
Hmm.
I just don't. I think that it used to be that you really needed them to make a book and to get distribution for a book, and I think those the degree to which you need both of those things is going down fast. And there are a lot of, a lot of people look at it from a business arrangement. And they're just like, gosh, I did so much work on this thing, and you know, I'm really making 10% of every book
Yeah.
that's being sold, like, is that right? And I've always been curious, what are the deals? I can't imagine that they are traditional numbers because typically royalty rates typically are fairly standard. But if what is Stephen King or
Yeah.
J.K., what are their royalty rates?
There are a lot more 50-50 splits, I think.
I would
And
imagine.
so
I mean,
I
yeah.
know I know in my world we're seeing a lot of that, which of course if you don't sell much, that sucks, right? You'd much rather have the big advance. But if you have a good name behind you and you know you're going to sell a lot of books, you're going to
Sure.
do much better with a 50-50
Oh,
split.
if you are a nonfiction author
Yeah.
and you have a giant following, I would never
Yeah.
sign a traditional publishing
Yeah.
contract.
You self-publish. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, well, you could, or come on, yeah, I mean, like partner with Ingram and just be like, you guys print them, you ship them. I don't want to handle returns. I don't want to do any of that. You guys
Yeah.
do it, and I'm keeping all that.
I mean, Amazon is pretty powerful. I mean, you can, it's print by order, all of that
Sure.
nowadays. And so depending on if you want to get it in bookstores. I mean, it all comes down to whether you want to get in bookstores. If you're not too worried about bookstores and you're happy with the online marketplace, it's
You
pretty
can
much
get you
plug and
can
play. Yeah.
And if it's a big enough seller, you can get it in bookstores.
Yeah.
Although if you
Yeah.
want to get it in bookstores, I was just helping a lady with this, who lives in town who wants to self-publish kind of a holiday book. Um, Ingram, which is the big distributor,
Yeah.
they have a service called Ingram Spark, which is you can even do jacketed hardcovers printed on demand.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the quality is good,
Yeah.
right? The quality is good. I mean, this book actually is, as an object, really beautiful. So the quality, I mean, and it has like, foil printing and all this special stuff. You're not going to get that from Ingram, but the quality is going to be good. And but the nice thing about going with Ingram as opposed to an Amazon is independent booksellers will carry your book,
Yep. Yep.
whereas many of them are not going to carry an Amazon published book. So it doesn't have that stigma, and you can still get it everywhere.
Right.